Okay, we've got everybody. Amar, thank you very much. And thanks to Defense IQ and Pearson Engineering for putting this on. Um, our format today with four really good, sharp panelists. None of them are very good looking, but all four of them are actually quite smart and experienced. We're going to have kind of a fast pace. We've got a series of questions that we've thought about that would address uh, many different aspects of mobility, from immediate vehicle mobility all the way up to operational mobility. And so what I'll do is kind of work my way through the panel asking an initial question, and they'll have 3 minutes to sort of give an answer. And then I'll come back to each of them with a follow-up, and they'll have a couple of minutes for the follow-up question. And then I'll be starting to look for questions coming in from the audience, or perhaps we go back through a second round of questions with our panelists here. But the point is to get as much conversation and audience participation in this 1 hour that we have. Richard, I'm going to come to you first. I know you commanded an armored infantry battle group, so you've got engineering perspective as well as maneuver perspective as well. Let me ask you first, how does the British Army see the future battlefield in terms of what's most likely, or you could also talk about which future battlefield would be the most demanding, and how will mobility and counter mobility play out in that particular scenario?
General Ben, thank you very much for the introduction and also the question. I would start by saying clearly there's many people from the British Army on this webinar who will have a view. So I am speaking not on behalf of them, but clearly my perception. We've seen the nature of conflict move away from many years of insurgency, and we now see a move back to maybe what many remember of the days of the Cold War, where perhaps the most demanding and maybe even the most likely is high intensity warfare, to use the American term of multi-domain operations, against a pacing threat, a peer versus peer, who will conduct conflict across all levels. And that sets me thinking that this most likely conflict in the NATO area of operations, Eastern Europe being likely, will involve both offensive and defensive operations. And I think the British Army is very much up with that. Its doctrine is first class, and we see such documents as the British Army Manoeuvre Support Plan talking about mobility and counter-mobility and recognising how important that will be to all elements on the battlefield. So I believe that we owe it to our warfighters to consider how we can best meet that requirement. So whether it's shaping ground, changing the ground, channeling, blocking, very much allowing ourselves manoeuvre on the battlefield and denying that manoeuvre to the enemy unless we so choose him to have it, is a function that everybody has got to attend to. And I cast that across the NATO net so that interoperability, which I know we will talk about, also becomes important. But to me, affording our soldiers the ability to put mobility and counter-mobility onto the battlefield at a time and place of their choosing is something that we should all be cognizant of. So that's really where my company is looking to contribute to the overall warfighter capability. General, back to you.
Thanks, Richard. So what kind of requirements are you getting from the British Army, or what are you hearing in terms of, in this kind of a battlefield environment, you know, the requirement has to come from the service. What are you hearing, and do you think that is the Army requiring the right things given that sort of a possible future battlefield?
Again, I think the British Army, and I'm sure many of our colleagues on this call are doing some very thorough assessment of the future battlefield, likely threats, and hence the requirement. And we are certainly seeing lots of requests, opportunities, programs around armoured vehicles, tracked and wheeled, heavy, medium and light, and how can we as a company, along with our other fellow defence companies, give those soldiers the ability to move around the battlefield to breach minefields, to close gaps, to open gaps, to cross rivers, to move earthworks, to create minefields, all of those what I would call traditional engineering tasks, which I believe now cascade beyond the engineer cap badge to the all arms battlefield. So yes, we're seeing a lot of interest, and one only has to look at the large amount of United Kingdom land programs, all of which have engineering somewhere within their requirements. Sir, back to you.
Thanks. Let me press just one more bit on this. What are you hearing from the British-led Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group up in Estonia, given the experience of the terrain? And of course, Jim, I'm going to be coming to you on this as well. But what are you hearing from recent experiences in the field there about mobility and that sort of terrain, and also?
I suspect there's others on the panel who know a lot more about this than I do, but I think there is a large amount of lessons being identified, which perhaps we already knew from many years ago. It's a demanding, challenging, difficult place to operate, and that's on top of, besides not fighting in a combative element where the peer enemy is perhaps trying to make your life worse. But I think it's something that we're not addressing fully, we're aware of, but it's going to take a lot of effort to catch up, I believe.
Okay, thanks a lot. Karsten, General Jakobsen, not only your own long experience as a German Army armor officer, but also your experience with preparing Germany's contribution to NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence, the German-led battle group in Lithuania, a multinational battle group. You did a lot of work helping prepare for that deployment and getting them integrated. But you also took 1st Panzer Division, prepared them for operations in Afghanistan and your own experience there. What differences do you see in planning for an intensive conflict in Cold War days versus what we're having to do today?
Well, the biggest difference is that we have to regain the capability of planning and operating in large formations under high intensity conditions. And it's one of the things that was probably the hardest challenge with an officer corps and NCOs right across the board, who for nearly 25 years did nothing else but stability planning, stability operations. This is a vast change, and the first thing that people have to learn again is that they're not only fighting against an enemy, in this case a peer enemy with the same capabilities, but they are fighting against the clock, because if you are late with whatever you decide, with whatever you order, with whatever you pass on, you've lost, and somebody else is inside your decision cycle. That was one of the big things in the Cold War, where we had a very clear enemy. We know more or less to the vehicle what type we had to expect where. We knew the areas in which we had to find. We had stable logistics, bunkered and secure and within easy reach. We had secured transport, rail transport and everything everywhere, and everything was planned to detail. I can only come back to the engineering thing that we just heard. We've lost a lot of capabilities. We lost nearly the mining capability in the German army, and I know others are no better off. The counter mining is a skill that has developed into counter IED, but counter mining is something entirely different. And we've lost, as we all know, vast amounts of bridging capability. And when we come to the Baltics, you're driving something like 30 to 40 kilometers, and you are in front of a large water obstacle, and on a very, very slim road net. By the way, for the first time again after more than 25 years, we exercised with a battle group there, and it's only battle group level we exercised in open terrain. Now, the civilian population greeted that and liked it, liked leopards driving on their little roads, but those roads are built for anything but for heavy tanks. So therefore, there is vast amount of changes. The biggest one probably is we're fighting all far away from home. We are fighting all with long-distance logistics, and we don't know where it's going to be. So first thing is find the enemy, identify him, get your own forces in position. We are talking free maneuver. And that demands on everything. It demands on logistic transport. It demands on command and control. It demands on tactical mobility in the battlefield right across the board. it's an entirely different game, but it's against a peer enemy under different conditions. And the conditions are in every field under hybrid warfare conditions or whatever you take, they are challenging. And with that, I pass it back to you.
Thanks, sir. What about your battle group there in Lithuania? What sort of lessons learned? I think you've gone through at least 3 rotations now. Maybe you're on your 4th. What are some of the key lessons that have come back about mobility? You address the water bit and the quality of the roads, but for example, do you have the right distribution of heavy equipment transports to move? And how interoperable are you, given that you have German, typically Dutch, Norwegian, other nations that are part of the element? Could
The multinational aspect is more or less dealt with, and we've now got a lot of people who are very experienced in it. We've made the decision that we change with the units that go in their main equipment. That was a challenge for the Lithuanians in the beginning, having a rotation armor heavy, a rotation APC heavy, a rotation wheel heavy. And they always had to integrate that into their defense planning. But that is a part of strategic mobility, of being able to bring these vehicles there, get them ready, get them integrated into the Lithuanian force. The Lithuanians are very open, very helpful. And I have to admit they've been very helpful, in particular in the last months, because we had COVID-19 in the Lithuanian camp. And under those conditions, you can imagine what that means for training. So the last, which was the 5th rotation, had a bit of a tough time on top of the tactical training. But they are back into it. The conditions are getting better. We had to start with simple things like building the right ranges, using the right ranges, doing the live firing up there and bringing them up to standard, where a German battle group does live firing integrated into a Lithuanian force. So it's working all right, but we always have to remember it is battle group level. And anything above it, bringing a brigade in or whatever we can manage or should be able to manage, has vast different challenges. Over to you.
Thank you. I know that your battle group, the German battle group there with the old Iron Wolf Brigade, takes this mission very seriously in terms of readiness, and also, of course, you're sitting there literally between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and in one of the areas that many people would consider one of the most dangerous areas if the Kremlin ever made that terrible miscalculation and decided to launch a strike. There's an excellent question from one of our audience that I'd like to bring into you now. It's from Dan Kratz, and he says, considering the range of artillery today, is the brigade rear area ready to deal with scattable mine threats? Can you, have y'all discussed that, or has the German army, the Bundeswehr, discussed this type of threat with the Lithuanians and how you might react?
Well, we all know from our own experience that the aim today is no longer to go for the dual situation. You don't really want to have the dual situation. You want to hold the enemy at long arm, which was managed in the Gulf Wars, which was managed in the conflicts with high intensity character in the last years. But now we're facing somebody with very vast range and with an amount of weaponry that we more or less got rid of. We still have anti-tank mines, 82, who are scatterable mines basically, but you're always on the border of the Ottawa Agreement, and you know that Germany takes the Ottawa Agreement serious. So we are fighting against somebody who is using stuff that we had, but we no longer have, and does that on long range. So of course it is a threat way beyond the brigade range. You can basically cover the whole of Lithuania right down to the ports with it.
Sure, thank you very much. Jim, let me come back to you, commanding officer of the Royal Tank Regiment. You know I'm going to want to ask what your insights are from the British-led battle group up in Estonia, but first let me ask this. What do you anticipate will be the role of heavy and medium armored vehicles in urban warfare? How are they best utilized, and what will be their limitations? And this is not a throwaway question, given all the studies that talk about. I mean, even President Putin said that he could be in Tallinn in just a few hours once an attack started. So you could very well end up having the British-led battle group in a tough fight inside Thailand. So how does armor, heavy and medium armor?
Thanks, General. As with Richard, I just say I very much speak from a CO's perspective, not necessarily the wider army. My battle group hasn't been to Estonia, is going to go shortly, but we haven't had the lessons of others. So I'll give my view, but that's all it is. In terms of how we best utilise armour, I think when you look back from some of the great lessons from US forces in Iraq, I think where the tanks really add value, or armour in general, is their ability to survive in a high threat environment where they can bring precision fires to bear. This doesn't mean armour necessarily soaking up hits. You've got defensive aid suites and the like to offset that. But I think where we've tried in the past to offset that by using superior mobility. I know the Australians tried to replace the tanks with ASLAV scouts in Iraq, only to find that it quite often got driven off by RPGs because the risk of a hit was too great, and then the dismounted infantry found themselves left without protection. Similarly, more lessons. Vietnam, going a little bit further back. When you look at US forces that used armour in the urban, I think it was 40% less casualties if armour was integrated into an urban operation, and it increased the chances of success by double. Other countries have looked at this in some detail. I was reading today about the Otokovar, which is the new Turkish tank that is designed specifically for urban warfare, or what they call optimised for war amongst the people. This impacts on mobility and creates a bit of a one-trick pony, and then you have the same problem when you find yourself operating in the open. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for using armour in the urban environment. We've just got to get our heads around it again, because 20 years of COIN has sort of taken us out of the game a little bit. There certainly are limitations. When you think that the first tanks were designed to break through enemy lines, I think the current generation of tanks are designed to kill other tanks, predominantly operating at pace and in the open. So when you put them in the urban, you find yourself in a 360 battle with a vehicle that is designed to look into depth and also has all its armour on the front. So straight away you've got problems there. But I think you buy out this risk by good old all-arms groupings. So putting in close infantry support and the likes, and also speed buys out a lot of the problems. And if you want examples of real success where heavy and medium armour has been used, just again, look to US forces. I'd quote the US Marine Corps, Fallujah, 2004, absolute success. But conversely, it's not an automatic win. If you flip it, a very similar situation with similar prestige forces in Grozny in 94, 95, where the integration wasn't done properly and wasn't there, but against the similarly armed enemy, absolute disaster. So, it's done well, it's a force multiplier, but there's scope for it to go back.
Let me follow up in envisioning, and certainly there were times where I wish we had had tanks in various parts of Iraq and also even in Kandahar. What about the development of remote or unmanned armored vehicles? I would imagine that, particularly in the urban environment, those might have a particular utility. Where's the British Army, or at least from your experience? I know you're not the spokesman for the Army, but I mean, what are you hearing from your peers there about?
Thanks, General. So quick pitch then. If you Google Project Street Fighter, you'll probably come up with the urban operations tank that the Royal Tank Regiment has been working on. And part of one of the innovations we've done on that is a bit of manned-unmanned teaming using UGVs. If I look at the mobility perspective, I think it's all about de-risking the fight for the commander and creating opportunities. If you've got unmanned systems, you can send them into places where you wouldn't perhaps want to send a crew vehicle. And if we work on the premise that we're against a peer enemy, obstacles are going to be covered with fire. So it's a real high threat environment. So there's advantages for the unmanned piece, and it gives the commander more options. Dare I say they're easier and cheaper to lose, as well as a lot more politically acceptable to lose than human lives. I think counter mobility is a little bit different because you tend to have a little bit more time to prepare that. So that's not something I've looked at. But I think unmanned teaming has broader applications, be it weaponized sensors or mobility. I suppose my only concern with unmanned teaming, however you use it, is if we talk about fighting amongst the people and hearts and minds, and we accept that is now a part of warfare, you need the permission of the population of the city you're operating within, otherwise life gets difficult. Where we found friction in Iraq and Afghanistan by approaching the locals with the wraparound sunglasses and the face covers up, they didn't like that. I wonder how they get on with sort of killer robots driving through their streets. I think that would be the main concern for me. But I think, in terms of their primary task, they offer lots of other opportunities. You've got dispersal, you can cover a wider area, and you also, by having UGVs working with your main vehicles, you create complexity for the enemy because they've then got to invest more ISTAR working out what's a UGV and what's actually a crewed vehicle worth hitting. Over.
All right, thanks a lot. Some great things to consider. If I could come back to General Jakobsen, Carson, where is the Bundeswehr on unmanned armored vehicles? Whether it's just the turret is unmanned or the entire vehicle? I think Germany's made some steps here already.
Well, we've got, of course, we've got unmanned vehicles, be it aerial, be it on land, primarily on engineer tasks. Again, developed in a counter-IED world. And not for counter-mining. The vast majority of vehicles are still manned. Now, I'm really supporting the idea of having as few men as possible, as few soldiers as possible in the dual situation in the front line, and control as more firepower as you possibly can from a safer distance. It also reduces the weight. A robot doesn't have to be protected like a main tank where 4 people have to be covered by the armor in front of them and still vulnerable at the sides. And weight is the big one. I'm coming back to what I said about Lithuania. The smaller we get the vehicle, the smaller we get the area that has to be protected for human life, the better. And I would prefer as little a crew as possible, and I would prefer something like have 2 or 3 exchange crews behind it, because we're talking a 24-hour scenario, so that after 8 hours another crew goes on the scarce vehicles on those who are manned. But the future will give us robotics, and you know that Estonia in particular is quite moving ahead on that. So we're having a careful look.
All right, thanks. Colonel Tom Hof commanded the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment. Tom, one of your squadrons is performing the mission now up in Orzysz in northeastern Poland. It's the U.S. Contribution to enhanced forward presence. What are you hearing from them about challenges to mobility, first in their specific sector, but also more generally moving?
Sir, I appreciate the question. I think maybe you're spying on me because your timing's impeccable here. We just completed a mobility exercise this week up at what we call the BPTA training area, so the Bitmo-Pomorsky training area with our battle group. So that's our 3rd squadron that has a Croatian battery, a Romanian artillery battery, and then we have the UK Recce troop as part of the battle group. So just this week we've practiced this, and here's kind of what we've learned. What we've looked at is, from our tactical perspective, it's about the number of mobility corridors that you can access. So a lot of the discussion I think we're having, and what we have here is, it comes down to a balance. We all want the most lethality. We all want the most protection. But it comes down to weight. So we use the Stryker vehicle. It's an 8-wheeled U.S. Army platform. With that vehicle that we use up there, we can use 85% of the county roads in that northeastern corner of Poland. The heavier you get, the fewer mobility corridors that you can use. If you was to take Abrams tanks, you could only use 25% of the county roads that are in that area. And so a lot of what we find in there, and General Jackson was talking about, the COIN environment versus the decisive action environment, that need to do the train analysis. Mobility in that corner of Poland is all about how you're going to get across the wet gaps. And so our idea is to keep the vehicle light, have as many access points as you can. Then organically to our formation, we've got 4 bridging capabilities, so we can span up to 13 meters to do a wet gap crossing, which we think gives us more tactical options for us to use.
Okay, thanks. You described your battle group, British recce troop. I'm sure they cause the most trouble for you in everything I can imagine. But the a Romanian air defense battery, I think, is part of it, and you have a Croatian company as well, and you work for a Polish brigade, or that your battle group does. What are some of the interoperability challenges that are, I mean, what's the nature of operating like that in an environment where the Russians would completely dominate the electronic warfare spectrum? You're clearly inside range of almost every weapon system they have. So the ability to work in an interoperable way is going to be critical. How are y'all?
So I would say, I think 2 things I could share with this group that would, be helpful. We still continue to talk in a multinational environment, especially in a pre-Article 5 scenario. How are you going to get to mission command? How are you going to achieve a common operational picture? And what mission command system is going to give that to you? And so that's probably where I see the greatest risk right now of how we're going to do that. There's that NATO network that would be there at Article 5, but what's pre-Article 5? Right now, each one of the battle groups has a battle group network, but at some point we're going to have the ability to have a cross-domain solution to get those networks to talk to each other, because it's through that mission command network that's going to give you all the other warfighting functions. So sharing intel, being able to shoot fires for each other, all those other things we got to do, but it's getting to that network.
So it seems to me that commanders like you and Jim helping get the requirements right, so that when our industry partners are helping to develop things, that they've got to go with a requirement from a field commander. And for me, the interoperability issue is always one that was most frustrating. I mean, you can't being able to talk secure in an area that if you're talking in the clear, a Russian UAV or ground-based system is going to detect it and either jam you or you're going to get hit pretty hard. So getting the requirements right are important. Okay, how about there's a Chuck, Tom Huff, this is for you again. This is from Alexander Holloway. It says, surely the first and foremost threat to mobility is defeating the A2AD. In this case, we'd be talking about the so-called A2AD bubble coming out of Kaliningrad. How do you see us doing this to facilitate the transition from theater entry to actual warfighting? So let's say in your case, your regiment has to move from Vilsek up in southern Germany, in Bavaria, up into northeast Poland. What are the challenges to mobility?
Yes, sir. So that's part of why I think for us in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, being a wheel-based platform is good for us. It's what we need, because frankly, right now we could move this regiment in a short couple of days. We could get the 363 strikers we have assigned to that corner of Poland rather quickly using the Autobahn system or using the European road system. So we don't have to have a secondary platform that you need like a HET to move a tank. So it gives us the rapid mobility with the wheeled platform. Now we don't take as much firepower or protection that you would need. However, I think what that allows us to do then, talking about that multi-domain operational concept, I mean, obviously that's really going to come from a joint fires perspective from the air domain, but getting that land domain open simultaneously, so you could get something like a fires brigade. So a potential where this striker brigade could be used to secure ground, get infantry on the ground, and get a fires brigade in range with MLRS HIMARS systems, so they can also help to begin that attrition of that A2AT bubble. Yes, sir.
General Jakobsen, if I could come back to you, same sort of question. You've got you don't have all-wheeled vehicles, so how do we get armor not just for the rotation, but say there's a crisis and a German armor brigade, perhaps as part of the NATO VJTF, has to move from home station to get to up to Suwalki corridor area. How do you get them there?
Well, we've tried all three. With Boxer, we tried road. Road works, similar to Striker. It's a bit heavier, but it has the same sort of capability. The problem is the punch that Boxer brings with it, which is not half that big as anything that comes on tracks. We've tried shipping with Marder's. That goes into Klaipeda, and we've both been standing on the pier of Klaipeda. And I said to you, if I was Russian, I would plan to close that little canal that opens up to the Baltic Sea with just something like 2 or 3 with concrete-laden barges in pre-conflict, and that's it for sea transport, and you've got to go up to Riga. You've got to make your way down from Riga. We've also tried rail with Leopard. That works fine, but everything that goes to the Suwalki Gap is going through the Suwalki Gap, and we know what that means. And again, Leopard, weight, on train, and we're talking about the Baltics. There it works because it's flat country, but when you want to go to other parts of the world, you are fighting with rail gauge when you're coming to tunnels. And there we have a problem because they are not to the standard that we were in the Cold War days. Over to you.
I'm going to come back to you in a couple of minutes with a hypothetical scenario. Okay, and imagine, but I want to give you a chance to think about it because the next question is going to be to Richard. But I want to give you a chance to think about the scenario. This is all about strategic mobility. Imagine the situation in Libya continues to get worse and worse. And Europe is looking at a potential 1 million refugees coming across as the conflict between Russia, Turkey, Libya, General Haftar, GNA worsens, and potentially 1 million refugees come across the Mediterranean to Europe, similar to the 3.5 million refugees came out of Syria thanks to Russia's support for the Assad regime. So if the EU, this is not a political discussion, this is a strategic mobility discussion. Let's just say the European Union or even a coalition of European countries decided that they wanted to get boots on the ground in Libya to prevent that from ever happening. Okay, what would be some of the, how would you do this? And you're talking about perhaps convoys moving through Switzerland or Austria to get down to ports in Italy. What are the different kind of things? And I wanted to give you a couple minutes to sort of, there's no wrong answer because we haven't done this yet. So just what are the kind of things that would come to your mind? Richard, my question is to you. This comes from one of our audience participants, Renee Kleint. How do you see the need to involve industry partners in the industry supply chain in the battlefield in the future? Richard.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about the relationship between industry and the military customer. And I think everybody understands that it's got to be improved. The passage of information from, as you say, General, the requirement setter, the commander who says, I have a threat, therefore I need, and then industry has to respond to that one. And I think if trust can be established along that passage, then the output can only be improved. Equally, I think industry needs to be better at talking to itself. I see as many partitions put up between different components of industry as I do between industry and the military. Yes, we are commercial, but we are all playing in the defence sector, and I think that's quite an important moral issue as well, especially when it comes to conflict and people are losing lives. As to when we get into conflict, I believe that industry has a part to play in terms of supporting the warfighter, and how far forward that industry support goes, I think is a doctrinal question. I suspect most military commanders wouldn't like to see someone like me meandering around the front line saying, can I fix this, can I fix that? So there's clearly a common sense solution. But I'm convinced it's a team effort, but it's got to be shaped in the correct manner. And I know that in many non-NATO countries, companies such as my own and others do put a lot of effort into through-life support of their equipment, which is actually being used in operational circumstances. So I think it's an important component that we should play to. Back to you, sir.
You know, interestingly, I remember in Afghanistan we had quite a few civilian support personnel, specifically for helicopters, for example, and other certain technical systems where the field service rep or the tech advisor was there and was critical to being able to function there. But it seems to me that we're moving more and more that way. And going back to Jim's points about robotics and unmanned systems, certainly for a few years, I would imagine we'd have quite a few civilian techs that would be part of this as while they're in the sort of the newer part. Let me turn back to Colonel Huff of the great 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment. First, Tom, one of the audience members says, not really a question, but Colonel Huff has the coolest background of all the panels. So the rest of you guys need to take a look at Tom's 2nd Cavalry emblem there and tighten up. But there is a question for you, Tom. Any insight? This is from Axel Biscay from Simtech. Any insight about the increase of flat tires on military vehicles in operation and existing solutions for this issue? How, you know, you're completely wheel-based. I always thought that tire technology was going to advance faster than track technology. I mean, are tires, is that a serious issue, or how do you deal with it?
Sir, first I'd just like to say, you know, I've got a Hollywood production specialist that works here at the regiment that does all this background work for me. Pretty impressive. To give you a quick number for us, so for a Stryker formation, obviously terrain matters. This is my 2nd Stryker formation I've been a part of. I can just tell you in my last Stryker brigade where I was a battalion commander, we went through 265 tires in one NTC rotation. So that's about a 14-day rotation we do at the National Training Center. 265 tires. Tires are an issue, and so you know there's no perfect solution. We keep talking about this balance between tracked and wheeled. I can make cases for both. I think it's a combination. I think, in my opinion, what the experimentation the UK 1st Strike Brigade doing, where they've got both tracked and wheeled, although it's going to be complicated, there's a lot of goodness in that. For us, we've just went through a lethality upgrade, so we've made our Strikers heavier. We've stayed under 25 tons, but we've now got 30 millimeter cannons on them, and then we've got javelin missile systems so we can launch a javelin from a Stryker platform. It did add weight. That's more pressure on tires that is there. The technology piece of it, the U.S. Army is going to next come out with what we're going to call the DVH A1 Stryker, and it's got a improved suspension system and an overpressure system, which will allow you to run, you can run 4 of 8 tires, so you can run with more than one flat tire on either side to keep that vehicle moving. But it is going to create a sustainment burden on these formations.
Well said. General Jakobsen, Carson, before I come to you for your strategic mobility question, I want to give Richard and Jim a heads up. I'm going to come back to you two. There's a question from Chris Craddock. What role do you see for artificial intelligence playing in ensuring mobility and counter mobility? So I'll give you two guys a chance to maybe look that up on Wikipedia and so see if you can come up with a reasonable answer. General Jakobsen, how are you going to get your division or your battle group from Hamburg or somewhere in Germany?
Well, from Hamburg, it's dead easy. By the way, I'm German, and knowing my history books, tanks have been brought to Libya before, in one or the other way. Apart from that, we've experienced it because I was the RSOMI general in the ARC, and we were rehearsing again what we did in the Kosovo campaign, where we brought Leopards over. The problem was Thessaloniki was the needle hole, and it wasn't the ships that was the problem. You normally ship from Germany, you ship from Emden or Bremerhaven. And ship is always faster than putting things on rail, getting it through the Alps, getting it down to southern Italy and everything. You're far faster down there. So shipment is highly likely the answer, and more or less always was. And it has been done when we went into the Kosovo, and we were not the only ones. The question is the port on the other side and the capabilities of how to unload that. So if the political decision would be taken, it would take something like 2-3 weeks, but it would take 2-3 weeks and more if you would do it via land, and you would have all the problems of the Alps, of rail gorge, of everything on the way, just to cut the shipment shorter, because eventually you've got to go on ship. So it's easier that way from the beginning. Just as a quick notice to Colonel Tom, I can assure you when we were exercising in Hohenfels, our tracks were worn out after 2 days, and the rubber pads were gone, and after 2 weeks you could throw half of them away. So it's not really that much of an advantage over wheel when it comes to that type of countryside. To the outsourcing that was mentioned earlier on, I'm a bit careful when it comes to non-combatants running around on a battlefield where there is intense fighting going on, because we are very quickly on the limits of the Geneva Convention. Over to you.
Super helpful as always. I will come back to you, Karsten, with a question about active protection systems. What's the German Army doing there? But first to Jim and then Richard. Artificial intelligence is part of mobility.
Hey, thanks, General. I get to sort of spout what I've read on Wikipedia before Richard does. Ahead of the game, that's good. I think, again, going back to my point on AI definitions, for us, that is the key piece. I think we are still quite nervous about a truly autonomous system that is weaponized or has any weapons on them. So there's an argument there to get over first. But I think there are certain roles that are potentially quite well suited to an AI capability. Something that comes to mind would be the laying of an AT minefield at reach. So you could have a system trundle out, lay a minefield with grids, and then trundle back. That would seem pretty sensible. Similarly with AI EW posts or sensor posts, stuff that's not going to be particularly reactive. It's just got a job. You go here, you do this, you report back. And I think the big advantage of having AI rather than just remotely operated is so when the Russians cut the comms, this thing can keep operating, because otherwise when you lose the link with systems, potentially you could lose the system. But I think whilst you're having close-in AI tasks such as a breach, I get it, it reduces the burden on the operator, but I think having the flexibility of having its operation at your fingertips and at least having a say in what it's doing still outweighs having a completely autonomous system.
Richard. Richard, can you hear me? Yeah, may have lost Richard.
Picture's frozen.
Karsten, let's go to you. Yeah, let's go to you with the question on active protection for German Army armored vehicles.
Well, we are in the same mode as most. So with bringing Puma in for the first time, we have explosive protective armor, in particular in the front sector, but it's not an active system. If you go to Rheinmetall, they have all sorts of solutions, and they've got actually very good solutions for active protection. It's basically in the moment a decision that is highly unlikely to be politically taken, that we build something on the tanks that actually automatically fires at an incoming round. Rheinmetall can give that to you. The technology is there, but I don't think that we will introduce it in the near short term. Over.
Thank you. So this is to Colonel Hof from Corporal Dave Kirby. Says, Colonel Hof, is it not better for troops on the ground to have both track and wheels with the lethality of tanks and survivability, whereas wheels help with maneuver? So I think what Corporal Kirby is asking about is it better to have some sort of a mix, or is that?
Yeah, so I would agree with you, Corporal. It is a mix, but in my opinion, it's a mix at the brigade level. I wouldn't go below brigade. So it's not uncommon at all here at 2CR for us to get a tank battalion. So General Jacobson mentioned going to Hohenfeld, the Joint Multinational Readiness Center. We were just down there last fall, and I had a French tank battalion, the 501st Tank Battalion, as part of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. And so we can do that, and in my opinion, that's optimal because, we have vulnerabilities as a wheel-based platform. One of our mottos here at 2nd Cavalry Regiment is "We kill tanks." We have quadrupled the number of AT systems we have here in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, but we still struggle. Really, the best thing to kill a tank is another tank. And so we can incorporate them into our formation that provides for protection. However, the inverse, what we see from those armored formations a lot of times is they lack that dismounted infantry to provide that local security, that protection. And frankly, here in Europe, you got to think about all the dense urban environments. You're going to need a lot of infantry to get into a dense urban environment. And so the two work together. There's a symbiotic relationship there. But I really think it's about taking a brigade-sized element, and then based on that mission, providing them with the armor that they need based on that particular mission set.
Jim, you want to?
Yeah, can I just come in, John? I completely agree with what Colonel Thomas has said there. But acknowledging keeping it sort of brigade level, not mixing below then, I'd just be interested to know what level does he train down to? Because one of the problems we've had, not a problem, but an observation, is that in the urban, particularly, a lot of times the fight is won when you've got a section of dismounts and a tank going around an opposed corner. But at that lowest level, they haven't worked together. The first time they see each other is usually at regimental level, battle group level, but it's that level that matters. So how do you train together?
Yeah, Jim, great question. I have found for us that the soldiers, our non-commissioned officers, they're still incredibly adaptable. I've seen us successfully do this down to the company or troop level. Where we really struggle is our ability to sustain them. And so I found that the training comes pretty quick from the tactical aspect. The struggle becomes when I've got that Allied or even an American tank, I don't have those parts in my inventory. So that process I got to go through to get those parts and get into that tank and get them repaired. It's really the sustainment piece. If I push tanks down to a lower level, I've got to push a sustainment package with them to really keep them running over time.
Carson, I'd like to come back to you. This is about the weight of vehicles. There's several people that are talking about weight. Colonel Richard Taylor has brought this up, and here's a question from Dean Gagnon. Protection requirements keep going up, and this drives up armored vehicle mass. What challenges do you think this will introduce in the maneuver support areas? So this, the challenge we've always had of weight because of increased protection requirements, but the road transportation networks that we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes or so, where are we going? Is it just going to keep getting heavier?
I think everybody agrees that we are too heavy in the moment. And you always got to think about what are the various vehicles for. I totally agree with nearly everything that was said. The wheeled vehicles give you a huge advantage in mobility, although they are also heavy. They are not that light, and the more you bring heavy guns on it, and we are thinking about the 13mm that we've got on the Puma to put it on the Boxer, and the Boxer can carry it, but it dramatically increases weight. Now, APCs are in the weight where we, in the old days, had tanks. The Puma is weighing more than the Leopard 1. Leopard 2 is crossed the 70 tons line, as many have, but they are for different purposes. And if I drive around a corner in that village and there is a T-80 standing behind that corner, I would prefer to be in a Leopard than to be in whatever, because the tank is made as a dual weapon, where you try to protect the crew not on the distances that we're always thinking about. We're talking about range overhaul, 2,500 meters, 3,000 meters. Those are rare situations, as we all know, that you are firing on that distance. When the tank comes into action, it's normally at a sizable distance, where the question is who reacts faster and who hits better, who's got the better fire and control system. And that is what we are training the crews for. You've got to have everything. The greatest disadvantage of the tank when it comes to urban operations is that it's got 360 degrees, but we all have very long barrels. And if you're in a very narrow road, the long barrels restrict those 360 degrees dramatically. And it's only horizontal, because you can't fire 90 degrees up. That you can do with a Puma, that you can do with a Marder. We are trying it all in Schnögersburg and Letzlinger Heide, as you know, and we practice it. Tanks have their advantage, but they also, everything has a price tag to it. And the right combination has to be decided tactically on the ground, where the tactical commander who says we are now going into a village, I need different equipment. I need 2 wheeled companies, I need that, I need that, I need that brigade, give it to me. And then I make my plan, and then everybody has its role. And if it is only that the tanks are covering the movement of the force that goes in, over to you.
Hey, I've got one last question that I want to ask, and it has to do with medevac. So I think it'll be interesting to hear maybe how Jim and Tom, the two of you, what is the status of medevac capability that's up in the enhanced forward presence battle groups? Okay, so I look for a quick answer, and then we'll do the lightning round in the last 5 minutes to ask each of the 4 of you. You get 1 minute to, like, what's your number one thing you want to make sure that the audience walks away with. Okay, so I tell you what, Carson, you, Tom, and Jim, let's talk medevac real quick first in each of the 3 battle groups that are sort of represented by the 3 countries. Tom, you go ahead.
So sort quickly, so we maintain our battalion-sized medical platoon. So that platoon comes with 4 of our Stryker medevac vehicles, and then we augment that with an additional Stryker medevac vehicle in each one of the troops. So that puts a total of 8 armored Stryker medevac platforms on the ground. The training, as we think about decisive action, what we do different, what's different than COIN, we talked about the golden hour, and we're going to get a helicopter to you. That is not the case of what we're talking about here in Europe. Now we're talking about prolonged care. We're making our medics and our providers better so they can sustain life forward, knowing that it's going to take us longer for us to get you out there and get you back to a higher level of care.
It's a great distinction.
Thanks, General. Much the same, because so we have armoured ambulances down at the sub-unit or squadron level, but as Colonel Thomas says, it's exactly that. It's prolonged care on the ground, because the famous MERT is just not going to fly in and rescue as it would have done in Afghanistan. But what we're also looking is increasing the med reach back, so technologies forwards that allow the medics access to sort of high-end surgeons and the like. You can sort of feed back the patient's status all the way back to a hospital in the UK where the experts are gathered around the table. So you can actually sort of forward load some really...
Carson, medevac for the...
Well, the same as for nearly everybody. We have the armored vehicles. We got Boxer in a configuration for medevac. We got wheeled vehicles of transport types, and of course there is always helicopter medevac. It's a huge discussion. Our medics have been used for years to golden hour, and the term was always we got to bring the quality of the medical support of a local hospital to wherever soldiers are operating. A, that is a transport question to get it there. B, what can you rely on? In Cold War days we had the nearest local hospital. That you don't always have in the areas where we are operating now. So therefore, you're really depending on the medical chain back home. And we are coming back to some ugly things like mass casualties and triage questions and so on. That to get back into the medical personnel's head is not always easy. I mean, we've all been through discussions of triage in combination with COVID-19 in recent days. It's some very hard and tough decisions, and it is even tougher. And we all know that soldiers will... Well, at least you pay a price tag when you cannot guarantee them that under any circumstances you will get them back. It's a difficult one. To Lithuania, to the battle group, it took me a long time, but the Lithuanians played to bring Role 2 into service in Lithuania. They got their role too now. And when they built it up the first time, and I went with the Lithuanian commander to that hospital, asked all the people the questions that you ask in a hospital about the various branches and everything, he said, "Oh, you seem to know about all this." Yes, we all do know about it. But then came something that made me smile and then talk something. He said, "We've built it up this once. It's a good and expensive facility. We will now pack it and store it." And I say, "No, you will not, Valdemaris. You will build it up again, and you will break it down again, and you will build it up again, and you will break it down again. If something breaks, you buy it new, because these things have to be rehearsed." By the way, the armored medics that are driving forward always caused me, when we were in training centers or so, the biggest headache, because sometimes medics are not able to read maps. And they're not able to identify a minefield that you've just driven around. They think the shortest way is right through it, and that adds to the problem. Over to you.
I can't even imagine that. Okay, Richard, glad we got you back. Here's what we're going to do. It's lightning round time. We're up against it, so 1 minute each. What's the main thing you want to make sure, if nobody remembers anything else you said over the past hour, what's the main sort of message you want to talk about with regards to mobility, whether it's about the vehicle, tactical unit, operational, or strategic mobility? And Richard, I'm going to come to you, and then Karsten.
Yeah, General, thank you very much. I'm very much talking about tactical ground maneuver, not the strategic operational level, i.e. the soldier on the ground. To me, it's a key facet of combat. It's all arms activity. It's not just the domain of the Royal Engineers or the engineers. Everyone needs to play their part in it. It has an unmanned, a manned, an AI component to it all. And as technology develops, I think industry has to move with that. It will operate across the battlefield, deep, close and rear. So it's not just your combat arms, it's your combat support and combat service support. And companies like Pearson Engineering do and need to continue to provide that capability, to provide engineering capability without adversely affecting the ability of the soldiers to conduct maneuver and warfight. So it's engineering capability, but cognizant of the fact that there's other things to be done as well. So.
Thanks, Richard.
We all know that fighting a battle on higher level is an orchestra, and you got to bring all the various instruments to play. My major concern, and you know me well enough, and you know what we've been doing, is retraining the skill of commanding and controlling on the various levels with the right reaches, the right people in the right skill. As I said in the beginning, it's a battle against time, and most of us had the discussion in our countries, do we keep the divisional level or not? And we were very, very close to scrapping the divisional level to put brigades directly under course. A stupid decision, because the planning horizon is totally different. The brigade is orchestrating the final fight by bringing the right elements together and bringing them into battle with something like a 6-hour planning horizon. People have to train that. The division is responsible for 48 hours, but it has to bring all the various assets together that the brigades need to do their job with the foresight into the right place, in the right timing, through all the domains. From command to logistics, they got to bring it all together. And the last thing then is the core with more than 72 hours out. So to bring those skills back into people's head and make them think that way is to me the most important. Over.
Thanks for saying that. Germany's 2 armored divisions and the the Quick Reaction Division are important assets for the alliance. And for the UK, your American allies are counting on UK to maintain at least one operational division headquarters. We really need that capability on the continent. So, Jim, you have 1 minute. What do you want to make sure everybody remembers, other than who your hairstylist is?
I haven't seen him for a while. So I think if we are going to be genuinely maneuverist and fast, mobility assets need to be driven down to the lowest level, and it's absolutely an all-arms sport. It needs to be affordable, modular, and we need to move away from specialist platforms, which are ultimately signature equipment and get targeted very quickly. And then the last bit is don't be afraid to ask for soldiers' opinions and ideas. They complement the ground procurement plans.
Excellent points. I'm a huge fan of common chassis and platforms for logistics reasons, but you just highlighted another very good one, not having I can remember at the National Training Center, everybody was always looking for the breach vehicle of the enemy formation. That's all you had to do. When you saw that, you knew what was coming, and that was, you make a great point. Okay, to the commander of the 2nd Regiment.
Sir, if I could leave something with the audience, I ask every company troop battery commander here at the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, I ask them to know what I call the 2 rules of the gunfight. Rule number 1, bring all your guns. And so as we look into the future, we don't really know what's going to happen. I don't think any of us knew we were going to have a global pandemic about 4 months ago. And so I think we've got to stay balanced. We're going to need light, we're going to need medium, and we're going to need heavy forces. But we're going to need those guns. Rule 2 is bring all your friends with guns. And I would just tell folks, continue to focus on multinational interoperability. It matters. Our greatest strength is this alliance, and the one with the most friends in the end is going to win this thing. And so I'd ask them to bring all your friends with guns.
Very well said. Hey, thanks to all 4 of you. Really super grateful for giving up the time to do the preparation as well as execution. So thanks. I've learned several things today myself. I apologize to all of our audience that we didn't get to every question, but certainly none of you are walking away empty-handed. Let me turn it back over to the boss, Amar.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Very, very much appreciate your time and effort going into this. Great discussion, and hopefully is the first of many, and we can keep this community ticking over and keep bringing the community together whilst we can't do it in a face-to-face environment. We will be sending a link to download this session in the coming days, and there's a short survey, so if people could please fill that in, give us some feedback. If there's topics that you would like something similar to be hosted on, please do let us know. But to the panelists, thank you very much, and that's all for today. It's a wrap.